Edge. We're so delighted that you're here for our program today. My name is Laura Herman, and I'm the Associate Director of Program and Evaluation here at JPro. JPro is the organization that is of, by, and for all professionals who work at Jewish nonprofit organizations across the United States and Canada. Our session today is going to be recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel afterwards. There's also closed captioning available that you can access by clicking on the More section on the bottom of your screen, and that you can see, you'll be able to see at the bottom of your screen. As we get started, I want to share a little bit about JPro's interest in this research and this topic. We recognize that issues of gender and equity in leadership have an impact on all parts of organizations, and that they also reflect some of the broader values of the field. At JPro, we're really interested in bringing this conversation to a wider audience so that we can all be part of thinking critically about creating more equitable and inclusive systems. As we get started today, please take a second to share in the chat what brought you here. Feel free to share a question, something that you're hoping to gain from the session, or anything else that moved you to take the time to join us. My colleague Laura is going to share Mordy's bio in the chat as you also add your comments, so that you can learn a little bit about him and where he's coming from. I'll give you 30 seconds now that I've prompted you with some questions to type those things into the chat. And then I'll explain a little bit about our program structure. We're going to begin with Mordy doing a more formal presentation about Leading Edge's research. And then we will pause for an interview with Mordy to ask him some questions about what he's learned so far in this process. And then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. As Mordy's presenting, please feel free to type your questions into the chat, or you can private chat them to me and I can include them in the interview portion of our program. And without further words of introduction, I'd like to pass it over to Mordy so that he can walk us through the research and what he's learned.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, JPro, for convening this conversation. And thank you all for joining. I know an hour of your time, especially in mid-December, is super precious. And so I feel kind of very touched and moved that so many people chose to join this conversation. Hopefully it'll be worth your while. And as Laura said, I'm just going to take you through a little bit about the research process that Leading Edge underwent really over the last year and a half. And then super curious for questions, thoughts. I'll share we are still in what I call the meaning making phase of this research. So trying to figure out kind of what are the implications of it. And the more thoughtful, smart, and invested people really help us shape where to take this research, the better. And so that's really kind of an open invitation to you. And really just thank you again for being here. So this is really what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to share with you the keystone causes, the persistent gender gap in top leadership in Jewish nonprofits. This is really just the research process that we went through. We feel it's important to share with folks kind of how we got to the conclusions that we got to. And of course, there's a universe of possibilities of conclusions that could have been reached. And so important to have that conversation. We do want to reflect a little bit on what's been happening since the research has been released. And then, of course, to have a conversation. So for those of you who don't know, I work for an organization called Leading Edge, and we were founded in 2014 to create a forum for the Jewish community to address the leadership pipeline challenges facing the American Jewish community. And the focus of our work is really around supporting executives, supporting organizations to improve their organizational cultures, and thinking about the lay professional partnership. And really all of those issues really intersect with this research. And this research really came, I would say, into focus for us as we took a look at what does the executive landscape look like in the Jewish nonprofit sector. And our key insight there was that those who are leading the Jewish nonprofit sector do not necessarily reflect the diversity of the sector itself. What's interesting is when we started out the research, we had been using this sort of 70-30 data point that a lot of folks have referred to, which is that about 70% of professionals in the Jewish nonprofit sector identify as female. And when you look at who is actually leading, who are the CEOs, that's actually flipped. So about 70% identify as male. And a lot of you know that we do an annual employee experience survey, and it's certainly not a census of the field, but it gives us some impression. And I wanted to share just some late breaking data from that, which is in 2021, when we look at the overall gender gap, it's actually a lot closer than the 70-30. It's about 55-45, again, just in the sample of about 250 organizations that we worked with this past year. But something that was interesting for us to note is that when you follow the money, if you look at, as organizations grow in their budget size, the likelihood of a male CEO increases significantly. And that's just something that we have been thinking about. And of course, budget size does not necessarily equate impact and mission, but at the same time gives you some sense, again, of where that gap exists and how it manifests. And super important to note that at least in our sample, there were no leaders who identified as transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary. And so once again, the diversity of the community is not reflected in those who are at the very top. This is, of course, common in other sectors as well. And you'll see here, this is an image from the Women in the Workplace report that McKinsey and Lean In put out every year. And basically the takeaway here is that in looking at both gender and race, as you kind of move up the hierarchical ladder of organizations in the corporate world as well, less and less diversity there and much more homogenous around kind of a white male leader. So in about 2019, Leading Edge decided to just take a closer look at this issue and to really ask the question, why does this gender gap exist? Really with the fundamental sense is we need our leadership to reflect the diversity of the community. The problems that we face are big and complex, and we are limiting ourselves and our potential if that's not the case. And so we partnered with this organization called the Starfish Institute, which had done work primarily in the education space. And what we loved about their research approach, I'd say a few different things. One, it was fundamentally about mapping an ecosystem. And we know that the Jewish community itself is an ecosystem. It's complicated, it's textured, it's relational. And we wanted an approach that would actually look at the system as a network itself and to see how all these parts interact with one another. And what we loved about their approach is that it was all about just really drilling down to the root cause of the issue and sort of asking the question again and again and again until you're not hearing anything new. And that process, we felt, would help really kind of map the issue. We know it's a complicated issue with no easy solutions. And at the same time, people want to know where to begin. If we actually care about addressing this gender gap, what can be done? And so our hope in partnering with them was really, again, to drill down to those root causes and then to identify what are the highest leverage places that if we focus some effort, we can actually turn the tide here. And again, one of our assumptions is that the Jewish community for a long time has tended to privilege what we're calling a traditionally white cisgender male model of leadership. And once again, that has limited our ability to do the kind of work that we believe the Jewish community has been primed and ready to do. Some assumptions that have been guiding our work from the get-go. First of all, the Leading Edge did not discover the gender gap. This is something that so many smart and invested folks all across the field have been working on for quite some time. You can't solve what you don't understand. And so it was important for us, given that we're a data-driven kind of organization, to actually, again, drill down to try to figure out why this gap actually exists. The people affected by the issue understand it best. And so while we definitely looked at academic research and all sorts of literature, we also wanted to make sure that we are just asking people affected by the issue again and again, why does this gender gap exist? How does it impact you? The goal here was not to what we call fix the women. So we knew that the conclusions that we'd reach would not just be, if only women did X, Y, and Z, this gender gap would be solved. And at the same time, the idea is not to prevent men from holding top leadership positions. So really trying to look at it from an abundance frame and to think again about how we can get the leadership to reflect the diversity of the community. And as I shared earlier, we believe that the Jewish community is an ecosystem and that really to figure out what to do, we need to understand how different parts of that ecosystem really influence each other. So the research itself, it took about a year, the whole process, and it unfolded in 3 different phases. So the first phase was getting to what we call a powerful mobilizing question that guides the work. And so just asking again, what is the research question? What are we actually trying to understand and analyze? we wanted to make sure that we were really, as I shared earlier, building on the work that had been done and that has been going on for quite some time in the Jewish sector, work by Shifra Bronsnick, work from the SRE network, things outside the Jewish world, including Lean In, McKinsey, Iris Bonet, all sorts of really important research that's out there in the field. And the question that we landed on is, it's not the most complicated question, but why is there a persistent gender gap in top leadership at Jewish nonprofit organizations? And here are just a few important words to call out. So one is the word persistent. So why has this gap persisted despite all sorts of other progress that has been made, both in the Jewish communal field and beyond? We did decide, and again, so many of these questions were controversial and much debated in Jewish fashion. We did decide to focus really on top leadership, which is that CEO or executive director at the top. And I would say that's for a few different reasons. It's not that we don't believe that leadership can be exercised from any part of an organization. That's absolutely true. But we were trying to look at, first of all, why is it the case that even in the C-suite itself is more diverse than that top leadership role? So what happens when hiring committees are meeting and are determining who to actually choose for that executive director or CEO role? And we know that for better and worse, CEOs and executive directors play an outsized role in the image of our community. And so we wanted to really investigate what is at play there. And then we are also looking at the word gender. And I would say that we spent a ton of time discussing whether we were looking at gender as a binary, men, women, or whether we are taking a more expansive view, looking at non-binary, transgender, and gender non-conforming individuals as well. I can speak to that later. This is an area where I don't think we hit it out of the park by any means, but it was something that we were attuned to in how we were trying to frame the question and to try to be as inclusive as possible and to ensure that, again, the full spectrum of gender identity is included in the question. Again, I don't think we got it right in the end, but it was something that was on our minds. Phase 2 is what we call citizen cartography, a fancy way of mapping the system by asking the question to hundreds, if not thousands of people. And the goal here was really to drill down to what we call the bedrock. So we have our problem. We know that the gender gap exists, and we know that we don't like that gap. And so the idea here in this phase was to figure out why is that happening. And we ran workshops, online surveys. This was both pre-COVID, during COVID, and sort of height of everyone trying to figure out the Zoom life. So we hosted dozens of conversations where, again, we asked this question again and again. Why is this gender gap happening? And if that's the case, why is that happening? Why is that happening? Why is that happening? Drilling down to what we call the bedrock or the root cause of the issue. So we designed, as I said, dozens of different opportunities, and we took one close look at the data. We talked to folks individually. We did both one-on-one and group focus groups. We looked at the data and we looked at the demographics of who was actually participating in our workshops and in our surveys. And we found that those who are participating skewed heavily towards cisgender white women. Super important subset, of course, of our field. And at the same time, we are finding that the data itself did not reflect the diversity of our community. And why is that the case? We found and we heard that a lot of folks either were not on our radar, and again, that's on us for the kinds of relationships that we had and the kind of the way in which the research had unfolded. And we also know that a lot of people with marginalized identities don't necessarily feel comfortable or desiring to be sort of the only one with that identity in a workshop or to come and represent an entire group. And so we designed what we called peer-led listening sessions with 7 different groups: Jews of color, Orthodox women, with men, with transgender and non-binary Jews, people with disabilities, really to create sort of more intimate, safe spaces for people, again, whose identities had not been very much represented in our data to date, to share their feedback with us and to share their feedback on the process and on the issue itself. And that helped us, I would say, come up with a much more textured map of what was actually happening in the system. And also, I think, elevated all the ways in which even how the research unfolded from the get-go was not as expansive as it could have been. So what unfolded from that process, and I would say the Starfish team did this phenomenal job where they coded about 1,200 different data points and drilled down to 5 overarching themes that encompassed 71 root causes. And here you can see, honestly, every time I look at this visual, it's both like mind-blowing and mind-numbing at the same time. Hard to figure out exactly what's going on. But each one of these dots here represents one of the root causes. And you can see the ways in which they map onto various themes. So one of the key themes here in pink is just straight up discrimination. And so we heard, again and again, the way in which straight up discrimination around gender, race, and other identities has shaped who is in top leadership roles. If you move counterclockwise, there were a lot of insights really around the way that the job itself is scoped. So the sense that the CEO and executive director job is unsustainable for everyone. And that really, again, limits the pool from which you can draw. Going up, systems to diversify, this sense that so many Jewish organizations and systems don't actually have policies and practices in place to embed diversity into the DNA of their organizations. Next, we heard quite a bit about traditional gender roles in Judaism and how those have seeped into the Jewish nonprofit workplace. Everything from challenges around separating professional and personal lives in our sector, and also to kind of who is seen as capable in what kind of roles, who is seen as more of an externally facing figure, who kind of like takes care of the home front in the office, and just again the way in which traditional gender roles have played out in the workplace. And finally, the sense that the Jewish community has not necessarily prioritized solving this issue. And of course, it's really hard to solve something if it's not a priority for you. So again, this was the full map of the system. And for those who really want to dig into each one of the 71 root causes, happy to share that map with you after. But something that was interesting to us is we also did this sort of informal map to think about, to what extent are these root causes particular to the Jewish community, and to what extent are they true no matter where you work and no matter kind of where in North American society you exist. And we found that actually mapped on to about a third. Roughly, a little more than a third were true both inside and outside the Jewish community, roughly a third true only for the Jewish community, and a little less true outside the Jewish community, but heightened within the Jewish community. And you can see some of these root causes here, those that the research team really felt were true for everyone. Things like those with caregiving responsibilities have less flexibility to pursue top leadership jobs. The sense that performance evaluations, just the way that organizations tend to see and measure performance, reflect gender and race-based biases, and that those in power really preserve the status quo. And this is, again, the case in the corporate, the nonprofit, and the Jewish nonprofit sectors. There were some causes that were very specific to the Jewish community. The sense sometimes that qualified professionals choose not to pursue top leadership roles in our sector for a variety of reasons. Again, the way in which traditional gender roles manifest in the workplace, and also how personal relationships sometimes seep into the workplace, and again, can inhibit the progress and growth of some people. And then those that exist kind of elsewhere, but also are really heightened in the Jewish community, this trend of women often taking on more administrative roles. And I would say like a troubling finding that we heard again and again, that women in power don't always support the advancement of other women. And again, that's something that emerged numerous times throughout the research process. So again, this was a robust, comprehensive, and often at times overwhelming map, 71 root causes, and all just sort of like laid out there like pretty clearly. But at the same time, a map like that did not actually enable us to see sort of where should we actually focus our efforts. And that's, I think, at the heart of the starfish methodology, which is identifying the keystone species or the highest leverage places for impact. For them, the keystone species are about kind of what keeps the ecosystem in check. And again, like if you focus on certain issues, what are those issues that are going to have these huge kind of domino and ripple effects across the entire system? And so you can see here just a little bit of an explanation of those. The keystone species in a natural ecosystem, as I said, issues that have the ability to control or keep in check a certain system. So they have broad reach to many other issues, but they themselves are influenced by few. So that means it makes them relatively less complex to solve. And it means that if you do solve them, if you do address them, it will have a large ripple effect. And you can see just here a visual of how that's kind of demonstrated. Some of you participated in this process. It was once again a crowdsourced tool that we put out there into the community to get, again, the community's sense of, if you focus on issue A, how will that influence issue B? And again, it was rolled up into this dynamic data system that helped us identify what were the 5 highest leverage places to focus. And you can see here a map of where all the 71 root causes mapped on in terms of their reach and in terms of their leverage. And you can see here in the top right corner that there were 5 that really had kind of an outsized impact on the system, again, according to this crowdsourced tool that we utilized. And here, here's where they are. So the first is around the role that board and funders play. And so one of the key root causes is that board and funders and others in power don't always hold Jewish organizations accountable for addressing the diversity of their top leadership. So this is really about kind of those in power being invested in the diversity of top leadership. The second is that many Jewish organizations have no talent strategy for DEI. The third is around the role that search committees and board play and the biases that they hold about what makes for a qualified leader. The fourth is around the role of men and the root cause of not enough men speaking out about or prioritizing addressing the gender gap in top leadership. And finally, a perception that is pretty persistent that you cannot be both a top leader and a primary caregiver. Here you can see, for those of you who have taken a look at our report, trying to also frame it in what is the opportunity. So of course, in the first one, there's this opportunity for board and funders and other powerful stakeholders to hold Jewish organizations accountable and really to incentivize them to elevate diverse leadership teams. For number two, there's this opportunity for Jewish nonprofits to implement talent strategies to advance DEI. There's an opportunity for search committees and boards that appoint them to implement processes to ensure that the work of search committees is professional, it's equitable and fair, and that the most qualified candidate is chosen for the role, like regardless of their identity. Fourth, that community members can actively work to shift our cultural assumptions about the capacity to be a leader and a primary caregiver at the same time, and really just kind of helping those mental models come together. And finally, that institutions can give men the knowledge, support, and incentives to speak out about and address the gender gap in leadership and DEI more broadly. So those are really sort of the big conclusions that the research really elevated. And I'd say that since the research has been released, what we've been doing is really, first of all, trying to share the findings with the fields. We've diagnosed the issue, but we have certainly not solved it. And so really trying to gather the insights and smarts of so many different people to help us figure out, again, what to do with this research, how to actually use it to move the needle in a powerful way. We are doing further research into how the gender gap manifests itself in Orthodox communities, because that's, again, an area of research that we found there was not a whole lot of in our data set. And so really trying to drill down into that subset of the community. We are going to be taking a much closer look at search committee interventions because we feel that's a really high leverage point. And right now, what we're in the process of doing is really gathering research-backed interventions for each of these keystones and really trying to offer to those kind of working day in, day out in the field, very precise and useful recommendations of what to actually do. Because even with these high leverage solutions, it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like a lot, and it can feel like we don't know where to start. And I think that's something that, that we are going to be trying to focus on early in the next year. So that's it for my formal presentation. I see the chat is blowing up a bit, and Laura's going to help manage that. But I'll turn it back now to you, Laura, and we'll take some questions.
Thank you so much, Mordy. I think this was an excellent, helpful overview of all the work that you did. It sounds like, and I've read the report that you put a lot of time and energy thinking about what are the best questions to ask in order to conduct this research and thinking about the best ways to present the data. And just to start us off with our questions, I'm curious if you can share a little bit about what you've learned since you released the information, and in those next steps that you listed, if there are any bright spots that have come up.
Sure. I mean, I think something that that we've learned, and I'll just say it with like humility, is that it's a lot easier to diagnose than to fix. And so what we've done is, I think, really helped in some ways to diagnose the issue. And I think that's so important. But the hard work really begins now. And I think that's also just something that we've been reflecting a lot about. Something that's interesting that I sort of gestured to is that we found that there's been kind of different appetite among different audiences for digging in to the research. I would say that some people want quick, easy fix solutions, while others really want to wrestle with the complexity. And I think both are important, and we're trying to figure out how to do both. I would say that the report has generated lots of useful public conversation and discourse. And I think we've seen a lot more organizations right now thinking in particular about very specific DEI strategies. And one that's really come to mind is around pay transparency and compensation equity in general. And I think a particular shout out to the Jewish Federation of San Francisco for the salary banding work that they have been doing. We highlighted some of that in the report, and there's an amazing article that came out last week that just like shares kind of the precise process that they went through and the impact of that. And I think so it's important to remember that so much of this work really happens at a granular level. And I think our research focused kind of up here, and the next step is really to kind of help it drill down. So I think definitely a lot more happening around pay and compensation in particular. I'd say there's also a lot of interest in the search committee process and elevating those who are doing it well and those who know that they are coming up short. We're getting a lot of questions of how they can be doing that better. And so that's been encouraging for us to see. I would say that a lot of men have also been asking, how can I change things? What can I do? And people are, I think, just asking really good questions about the connections between policies and behaviors, and knowing that kind of neither is sufficient alone. And I think that's something that we often forget, is that even with the best policies and strategies in the world, those need to be manifest in kind of day-to-day behaviors as well. And so that's something that we are trying to look at, the sort of behavior science piece, and to think about how to actually move the needle there.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. When you frame it as policy and behavior, it actually reminds me of the keystone about the perception of women as leaders, that it's in conflict with their perception that you can't be a caregiver and a CEO at the same time. And one of the things the JPro staff team, as you're aware, but I'll share with everybody else, we've been reading the study and digesting it together as a group. And one of the questions that we had, and I see that it was also asked in the chat, is about this issue of perception and reality. Why is that keystone listed? Why is the word perception used in that keystone when really perhaps the reality of a CEO type job is cannot be sort of combined with the caregiving responsibilities?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think the answer is it's obviously both. It's both the perception and it's the reality. And again, like, we didn't come up with this root cause. It emerged organically from the process of us asking the question. I think we had that same question as you, like, is it about how the job is actually scoped, or is it about the perception? And the way that we've been trying to understand this is that thinking about how it boils down to mental models. So people sometimes struggle to imagine that someone can be committed to their family and lead an organization. And it's this mental perception that often limits who we look for in a leader, how a position is scoped, and so much more. And so I think, like, the theory behind this root cause is that you can shift the perception first, and then you can create a new reality via a shifting of perception. But of course, it could be the opposite too. And we definitely heard again and again about, like, the unsustainability of the job itself and how the job is scoped. None of those actually rose to the top as highest leverage solutions. I think because there was a sense also that that's going to be so hard to change. Not that the perception is easier to change, but at least, yeah, the way that we've been approaching it is thinking about kind of the mental model and just trying to kind of break down that dichotomy that exists for so many people, that you can only be, committed to your family or lead an organization and not do both simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Before we move to the questions that have been appearing in the chat, and thank you for putting them there, please continue to do so. I'd like to ask you a little bit more of a personal question as it relates to this research. One of the keystone addresses how men can show up as allies in this work. And I'm curious, as your perspective as a male identified person, on a more personal note, how you think about showing up as an ally in this research and how that relates to some of the broader questions of gender equity.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. And I'll just share personally, like, I grew up in a very strong feminist household where, gender equity was modeled, and it was kind of hammered home to me, like, from the day I was born, that gender equity needs to be an issue for all genders and not just women. And that's just something that, again, I think is like part of the DNA of my family. And I'll share that throughout my career. I've been blessed by so many tremendous female identified colleagues, mentors, bosses. And I'm hyper attuned to the way that despite the fact that I'm not sort of like an alpha male type, my gender has offered me certain privileges. And I really have felt those privileges manifest in so many ways. And I really feel and believe that that really limits our community's work and effectiveness. And so it feels personal to me. I'm passionate about the issue. And I also, I think, want to model how men can engage in it. Like, I'll share, our research team was all female identified. We're a female-led organization. And at the same time, I was leading this process, but from sort of behind the scenes. And I think that's important to model also, to how you can do important work on the back end while also not being front and center, enabling other voices to carry weight, but not disengaging from the issue. And as I shared in the research, I convened a couple of these focus groups for men. And it was fascinating to hear to some of those insights that emerged, like a lot of men feeling, first of all, that either they're not allowed to say anything about gender, or that they're going to say the wrong thing, or just that they're worried about losing the roles that they have gained and losing. There's a sense of loss that is emerging for a lot of people also, just in the way that the world is shifting and changing. This question of kind of personal responsibility and how that manifests in communal norms. I think they're just important questions to be had. And I think and hope that this research was stronger because we tried to be inclusive of all genders and not just focus on cisgender women.
Thank you. To sort of transition us to some of the questions that have been appearing in the chat, I've received a couple of questions about examples of places where women are serving as CEOs or in C-suite jobs, and what has sort of appeared as success in those areas. And are there examples of that kind of work that relates to these keystones that Leading Edge knows about or that you're able to highlight?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think we look both at the Jewish world and I think at sort of the global political stage. I think a lot of people point to, for example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the way that she has modeled leadership, both like throughout the pandemic and even prior to that. And I think, at least like what we're hearing from the research and from the field, that it's important to elevate kind of multiple models of how women lead organizations, and not to say like this is like the one way that women can or should lead organizations. We know, for example, that there have been a number of high profile searches in the Jewish community over the past few years where women have gotten the roles, JDC, JTS, and they're doing phenomenal work. And they're, the major organizations still tend to hire men. And so trying to, I think, balance both. I would say that we're still early in a lot of these to try to tease out, and it's tricky, I think, to tease out the precise examples and what they can teach us. But I think it's an important question to delve into.
Mm-hmm. As you were discussing the 71 factors, I believe it was 70 or 71, somebody asked about if there are areas that the Jewish community is actually sort of demonstrably performing better than other sectors. You sort of highlighted the differences, that maybe there are some places where the Jewish communal sector is not doing as well, but is the reverse also true? Do you have examples of that?
That's a really great question. And I don't think we have any exact data on that. What we do know is that, what we hear is that people are encouraged by the number and breadth of conversations and initiatives that have been popping up since, the Me Too movement, essentially over the last almost 5 years. The breadth of opportunities and conversations that are happening. So whether it's all the work that the SRE network has been putting out into the world, the Gender Equity and Hiring Project, sort of the way in which the Jewish women's philanthropies have been investing in these issues. And so it definitely seems like there's a lot of community. One of the Genesis prizes, this actually emerged from that, really focused on gender. And so I think that is an area where we are doing well, that there are, again, multiple modes and ways that these issues are being elevated and put forth.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the sort of like intersectionality of all of these issues, one of the things that the JPro team noticed as we were reading is that a lot of the factors relate to each other, that there are the keystone sort of factors. There's information about the boards, there's information about a DEI talent strategy, and there's information about the perception of people. And without all of those pieces working together, we found that it might be hard to actually solve one of those on its own. I'm curious about your reflections, given the fact that the idea of this research was to isolate levers of change. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how those levers actually intersect and interact with each other.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think part of what happens when you work in an ecosystem is that everything is connected and you can't separate. And I think, right, one of our goals was to try to isolate a few different things. I would say it's useful to maybe look at it in terms of a few sort of overarching themes. So one of them is around power and how those in power often don't want to give up power. And that manifests itself in a whole lot of ways, right? In kind of board and funder investment, in search committees, in men speaking up, right? And so at the same time, though, if we framed it as power, where do you actually begin? And so the idea there was to try to tease out different kind of inroads to that. So if we help one organization really improve their search committee process, what will be the ripple effect in terms of other organizations and in terms of, or at least that specific organization and their DEI strategy and sort of how they can build from there. So they're absolutely connected. And at the same time, we were trying to put forward this sense that there is a way to kind of make inroads in specific ways that then can spread.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about like who you think are the appropriate actors for all of these keystones. If we identify that there are levers of change and that there are certain opportunities to make these changes, who are the key people that can implement some of those actions in order to make progress on the issues?
Mm-hmm. Great. It's a great question. So I think board and funders are big here. And I think we know, like for better and worse, board and funders hold a lot of formal and informal power in the Jewish communal world. And so both their ability to say something and do something, I think was really sort of elevated throughout this report. The second keystone around a DEI strategy, I think that's something that kind of anyone who is either in kind of an HR or a people or a talent function in their organization, or anyone who's a manager or anyone really in an organization can have the ability to influence the way in which these issues get elevated on the management front. And so I think that's a place that we see sort of a lot of opportunity for a wide range of folks to be invested in. And then of course, search committees is a big one. And of course, those are often, made up of board members and funders, but we're also trying to encourage search committees to even expand who is on them, right? And so to expand who gets to make those kinds of decisions and who holds that kind of power. And so that's definitely a key one. And then, of course, men. And I think the media, the Jewish media also has a role to play in that perception piece and how they are talking about and depicting top leaders. And again, like the way in which the caregiving dimension plays in.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the role of board and funders. We actually received a question about the level of interest that funders have in these conversations. I don't know if you've presented to some of the members of that community and what their reactions have been. And additionally, I'm curious if you have any resources about how to, like on a very practical level, about how to engage in these kinds of conversations with board and funder communities.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll share first of all, in the research process itself, we hosted a few different conversations with lay leaders, so including board and funders, and we found tremendous investment in the issue. And I think, again, in helping us diagnose the issue, we found board and funders to be deeply interested in that work. And I think some of the findings, it can be hard because there's so many phenomenal board members and funders out there who want the Jewish community to look different than it does. And some of the findings point to the roles that they have yet to play and to the way that this is not manifested systemically. And I think, of course, like if you're working on these issues day in, day out, like that can be challenging. And at the same time, a lot of this is really, as I said, about power and the way that our community, like some people, ask us even about the wording of the first keystone, which is that board, funders, and others in power don't always hold Jewish organizations accountable. And they say, why is it up to them to hold Jewish organizations accountable for addressing the diversity of their top leadership? And I think that's a great question as well. And we wanted to recognize that to a large extent, that is how the community still operates, is that we are accountable to those who fund and who make this work possible. And so I think it's a tricky dynamic. And we have been finding a ton of interest. This work would not have been possible without the investment of funders and philanthropists who really wanted to see kind of what the results of this work could be. I'm happy to connect offline for those who want to have a conversation about how to engage there. I think it totally depends on kind of the culture of the board and where the board is at. But I do think there's a tremendous hunger for these kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, I see actually a few people have asked for additional resources in the chat. So thank you for putting those comments there. We will save the chat so that we can follow up with you and share some of those resources. I want to ask a question actually about the details of the map that you showed us with the keystones and all of the how they relate to the 71 factors. On the side that on the slide of it, it sort of showed on the top right of the graph that there were some other keystones that were, some other factors that were far away from the elements that were highlighted. And does that mean that is like a correct interpretation of that to read that we shouldn't really be focusing on those other 66 factors or how they all interplay? Like, how do you account for those other factors, even with the main keystones? And for the person who wrote me that question, please help clarify in the chat if it's not clear the way that I'm asking it to Mordy.
Yeah, so what I think you're asking is, so we identified 71 root causes. We're saying you should focus on these 5. What happens to the other 66? I mean, I guess what the research team would say is like, yes, only focus on these 5 because you only have limited time, resources, and energy. And this is where, as a community, you should be focusing those resources, time, and energy, or else kind of that energy becomes kind of dispersed in ways that are not effective. At the same time, I think there's another useful perspective that would share like anything that you are doing that addresses a root cause is useful and is going to help with some dimension of incremental change. And that's often like where I land is that, and also we got some feedback that this crowdsourced tool that we used was like so intense and heavy and wonky that, you know, and that's really what led to these 5 keystones that at the same time, we can't necessarily fully, I would say, like buy the results of that, which I think is also an important piece of feedback that we got. And so to my mind, it's useful to digest all 71. It's useful in any way to approach solving if your organization or you as an individual are positioned to do so, because not every organization or individual is positioned to work on one of these 5 keystones. And we'd rather them engage in one of the root causes than to disengage completely. And at the same time, yes, part of the goal was really to drill down into what will have the most impact. And that's kind of where we landed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to go back to one of the things that you shared at the very beginning of the presentation, which was about the gender binary in this research and folks who don't fit into, who are gender nonconforming or who are gender non-binary. There have been a few sort of comments and questions about that. And I'm curious, I know that Leading Edge led a peer group of individuals who fall into that category in order to learn from them. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you learned and how we can begin to think about the gaps in leadership. I won't even use the word gender in that phrase, the gaps in leadership for folks who fit into all different gender identities.
Yeah, it's such a great and important question. And I think as I shared earlier, it's not an area where I feel like we did such a great job. I will share, when we started out the project and, you know, we honed in on the question, I think we naively thought like, we're going to invite a whole bunch of people and they're going to help us, you know, articulate exactly kind of like how to approach this issue. And we heard that even in the question that we articulated, like we got really good feedback from folks at Keshet and beyond, that even in the way that the question itself was articulated was too binary and was non-inviting to folks who identify outside of the gender binary. And so we learned a lot throughout the process that kind of even like we assumed that like bringing in folks at stage kind of 3 or 4 would be the right approach. And I think we learned that the negative impacts of not bringing in folks from like step 0, I would say. And we did try to correct throughout, and we did host a number of different listening sessions, and we did 3 in partnership with Keshet to really try to better understand the trans and non-binary experience. And I would say both gathering insights from those who work inside the Jewish sector, from those who left the sector, and for those who would not even consider working in the sector. And the findings were really troubling. We heard a lot about transphobia in particular, as well as a lack of education around trans issues and kind of the way that persists in the Jewish community. We learned a lot about, I would say, just perceptions of professionalism and how people who identify beyond the gender binary are often kind of not elevated into kind of public facing positions for all sorts of reasons. We heard the way in which camp and youth groups are a huge pipeline for work in the Jewish professional field. And, if those spaces are not trans affirming, then this pipeline is virtually closed to trans people. And so again, like I shared that data point at the beginning, that none of the CEOs in our sample identified beyond the gender binary. And so also trying to think about, right, what's happening at the very beginning of the pipeline. We heard that, people make assumptions that if you're trans, you automatically have a certain political agenda. We learned all sorts about like HR policies that are really kind of limiting for folks who are trans or non-binary. And I would say at the same time, like we did not do a sufficient job of incorporating those insights into the report and into the way that the research itself manifested. And part of it is that some people said, like, you should just be very focused on the findings. We don't want to overcomplicate things. We don't want to, if you're, so expansive, then people are going to lose your core message. And I think that's a tension that we really experienced throughout. And again, it's not somewhere where I think we did a great job at. I will share 2 things. Like, one is that in one of the versions of the final report, which you can see on our website, we do include the insights from all the peer-led listening sessions. So you can read a little bit more about some of the insights that unfolded there. And in the tree map that I shared, there is a lot that I would say really elevates the way in which it's sort of anyone who does not identify as a cisgender white man, the way in which their leadership is seen by the predominant narrative in the Jewish community. And I think that's also a useful lens on things. And we're going to be putting out an op-ed by our CEO, Gali, about kind of the missteps that we made here around trans inclusion. And I think that's something that we've been thinking about a lot and reflecting on, and are looking forward to sharing that and getting feedback from folks.
Really looking forward to reading that. I think one of the things that as I've been working with you on this program, one of the things that I really appreciate is your honest reflection about the process and the ways in which you got it right and the ways in which that you didn't really get it right. And to follow up on that question, I'm curious, given your reflections on the lack of inclusion of non-binary people, what are some of the ways that you anticipate better including those people in the future, or accounting for some of the lessons that you learned from the peer learning groups?
Yeah, I think for me, the key insight is ensuring that these kinds of questions are not afterthoughts, that they're not sort of supplemental questions that you come to after you do the core work, that this is part of the core work. And so thinking about how to embed a certain sensibility and attunement into everything that we do, into every resource that we put out there into the world. And so not to say like, on the side is going to be, our trans inclusive resources on, working in the Jewish nonprofit sector, but how do we ensure that everything that we do has that lens to it? And I think that's an important kind of internal education piece for us and the organization. And it's something that I'm hoping that we'll be able to hold ourselves accountable towards.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple more questions for you, and please, I think we have about 5 more minutes for questions. So if anybody has some last minute burning thoughts, please put them in the chat so I can try to capture them. I'm wondering from a recruitment perspective, if your research generated any insights about what individual women can do to discern whether they're not securing a CEO position because of gender bias or because of something that they did individually in the search process, and where personal growth is needed and where there's like a problem with the system and that's why they're not getting the job or securing the role, and how we can help people think about that, in their own professional growth and how they're interacting with their jobs.
I think it's a really tricky question, and I'll share that the lens of our research was really on the system itself and not on anything that individual women have done. Like, of course, we know each story is itself so textured, and each story can have dozens of reasons why someone was or was not accepted for a particular role. And we are much more interested in what are the broader trends and what are the root causes behind all of that. And so I'll just share, I hesitate to say anything about kind of the first part of that question, because it feels like it goes against the spirit of what we were trying to do, and that sort of fix the women phrase. I'm not going to say women need to learn how to negotiate better and women need to do X, Y, and Z, because that's not, I feel like it's not for me to say, and it's not the lens of the research. Of course, there's so much that each of us can do to grow and to kind of continue to develop our own capacities. But yeah, I would say that the focus was much more on how those in power are perceiving those who are approaching these roles, and how, we hear a lot even about coded language in job descriptions and in other ways. Some people point to words like gravitas, like a CEO needs to have gravitas as kind of being an inherently male. So we're much more interested in thinking about sort of those questions. And so, yeah, I apologize. I feel like I can't speak to that very well.
I think that's totally fair. And I think that what you're highlighting is one of the things that we talked about as our JPro staff team when we were looking at this research, is the subtle nature of when we picture a CEO, what do they look like? And I remember reading in the New York Times at some point that in order for female scientists, for us to acknowledge that women should be scientists, we should just look at more pictures of female scientists. And so maybe we should just look at more pictures of female CEOs or non-binary CEOs. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but perhaps it would help change this perception. And, as one of our final questions, I'm curious, because we don't have a governing body of this ecosystem, a lot of the research is focusing on these systemic issues that, it's not up to the individual to change, but in reality, we don't have a governing body or a way to sort of ensure that these systemic changes are happening. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how we can account for that in the decisions that are being made at each organization, because there's nobody to hold anyone accountable to this work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And to me, it just points to just really emphasizing the deep responsibility that anyone who holds any power, whether that's in an organization, a community, whether that's formal or informal. And so just to kind of yes, there is no governing body. No one is going to force you to do this. That means it's up to you. And so to my mind, that's a key frame here. And I guess I think about the ways in which certain voices in our community do have a major impact, and how those voices can be sort of channeled in the right directions. And at the same time, how we can kind of increase and expand those who have voice.
Mm-hmm. I think that was a perfect question to end on. I think what you just said about how we all hold some of this responsibility, and even if we may not have positional power, we may be able to think about ways that we can use the power that we do have to help affect this change and make progress on the persistent gender gap. So Mordy, I just want to really thank you on a personal note and on a professional note for taking the time to share with us today the formal presentation and in this much more candid conversation. It was really a delight to be able to ask you these questions and get to know your perspective on this research. So on behalf of myself and JPro and everybody who has joined us, a really, really big thank you. I know that December is a crazy time, as you mentioned, and I really appreciate you taking this hour as well. As a closing word of note from the JPro team, I want to highlight that we have a few upcoming opportunities, a series of master classes that are already open for registration in in January. In January, we have task management with less stress and social media for your Jewish nonprofit. There's also time this week before Thursday for you all to join us for our Spotlight Logic Models Masterclass. My colleague Shlomo will put a link to all of these in the chat so that you can learn more about them and join us. And we'd like to take a moment to collect your feedback on the program today. At JPro, we take feedback very, very seriously. It's always helpful to learn about your perspective on these conversations and to hear what you think. So please take a moment to share your feedback with us. And without further words, thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here, and we hope you have a relaxing holiday season and a good start to your new year.
Thanks, everyone.